At exactly 12:03 on Christmas morning, my phone lit up on the desk beside my coffee. My daughter's voice was shaking so badly, I almost didn't recognize it. "Mom, why did the Pentagon just call Dad?" I stopped breathing for a second. The operation center around me kept humming like nothing had happened. The radios crackled. Someone laughed at the far end of the room. A wall of monitors tracked weather across the southeast. I looked at the clock again. 12:03 a.m., Christmas Day. There are certain phone calls you never forget. That one joined the list. But to explain why my daughter was crying in the middle of the night, I have to go back 3 days. My name is Linda Carter. I'm 58 years old, and after 24 years in Army logistics, I took a civilian job coordinating emergency operations at Fort Liberty, North Carolina. It isn't glamorous work, but it matters. When storms hit, when equipment has to move, when people need answers, somebody has to keep the gears turning. Most days that somebody is me. My apartment sits about 15 minutes outside the post in a quiet neighborhood where retired soldiers seem to outnumber everyone else. Nothing fancy. 2 bedrooms, beige carpet, a tiny balcony overlooking a parking lot, and a fake Christmas tree I've been setting up every December since 2014. The tree leans a little to the left. So do I, these days. I'd finished decorating it on December 22nd. White lights, a few wooden ornaments Emily made in elementary school, one tiny brass angel my mother bought before she passed away. Simple. That was enough. I'd just settled into my recliner with a mug of coffee when my cell phone rang. "Emily." I smiled before answering. "Well, look who's calling her old mom." She laughed, but it sounded forced. "Hi, Mom. You done with your shopping yet?" "Almost." There was a pause, the kind that tells you somebody is trying to find the least painful way to hurt you. I knew that pause. I'd lived through enough military casualty notifications to recognize hesitation before bad news. "Everything okay?" I asked. Yeah, another silence, then she finally said it. "So, Dad and Melissa are hosting Christmas this year, I know, and Melissa's parents are flying in. That's nice." Another pause. "We really want her to feel like she's part of the family." I stared at the little angel hanging on my tree. "I see." Emily rushed the next sentence. "It'll just be easier if it's, immediate family." Immediate family. Funny how a daughter can say 2 ordinary words that somehow erase 34 years of motherhood. She wasn't trying to be cruel. That almost made it worse. I looked out the window at the parking lot. Somebody was loading groceries into a silver Ford Explorer, while Christmas music drifted from another apartment. Life just kept moving. "I understand," I said quietly. "You do, I do. You aren't upset." "Oh, honey." I smiled even though she couldn't see it. "I've had worse Christmases." That part wasn't a lie. I'd spent one Christmas sleeping inside a canvas tent in Kuwait, another eating powdered mashed potatoes in Afghanistan. Compared to those years sitting alone in North Carolina didn't seem like much. Emily sounded relieved. "Thanks, Mom. I hope everybody has a nice time." "We will." We talked another 5 minutes about work traffic, and whether she'd finally replace her aging Keurig. Neither of us mentioned Christmas again. After we hung up, I sat there a long time without drinking my coffee. It had gone cold. The next morning, I drove through the gates at Fort Liberty before sunrise. The MPs waved me through. Same routine, same roads, same rows of brick buildings I'd been driving past for years. Inside the Emergency Operations Center, holiday staffing was posted on the whiteboard. Several names still had question marks beside them. Nobody likes working Christmas, especially the younger folks with little kids. I walked into my supervisor's office. Mark Reynolds looked up from his computer. "Morning, Linda. You still short on Christmas coverage?" He leaned back. "Actually, yeah, I'll take it. You sure? Positive?" He frowned. "You worked Thanksgiving. I know, you don't have family plans." I smiled. They changed. He didn't ask another question. Military people learn when not to. By lunchtime, everybody knew I'd volunteered. Specialist Jordan Ellis looked genuinely confused. "Ma'am, you don't mind giving up Christmas?" I shrugged. "Somebody's got to answer the phones." He laughed. "My wife would never forgive me, then don't volunteer." Around the office, people traded stories about wrapping presents, burnt pies, impossible in-laws, and toddlers waking everybody before daylight. I smiled at the right places, joined the conversations. Even laughed when one young captain admitted he'd accidentally bought his wife the exact same air fryer she bought him. Life has a funny way of reminding you that normal problems are actually blessings. That evening, I stopped by Harris Teeter for groceries. The checkout line stretched halfway down the aisles. A little boy in front of me kept begging his grandmother for candy. She finally sighed. Fine, one chocolate Santa. He celebrated like he'd won the lottery. I couldn't help smiling. Back home, I heated up tomato soup and watched an old Western on television. The apartment was quiet, not lonely exactly, just quiet. There's a difference. Christmas Eve arrived cold and clear. By 6 that evening, I was already inside the operation center. Someone had put a plastic wreath on the door. The cafeteria served turkey, stuffing green beans, and pumpkin pie on disposable trays. I sat alone near the window. Across the room, younger soldiers balanced paper plates while video chatting with their families. One little girl held her new teddy bear up to the camera. A soldier beside me laughed when his son proudly displayed mismatched Christmas pajamas. Those tiny moments made the room feel warmer. I finished my meal and carried my tray to the return window. Back upstairs, I settled into my workstation. Weather reports, staffing updates, routine maintenance requests, quiet. Just after 11:30, I poured myself another cup of coffee. Outside, Christmas lights blinked across the base housing area. Inside, the digital wall clock counted down another ordinary shift. Then my cell phone buzzed. Emily. I smiled, expecting a quick Merry Christmas. Instead, I answered to the sound of my daughter crying. Mom. I pushed my chair back so fast it rolled into the wall. Emily, what's wrong? She tried to speak, couldn't, then finally whispered the words that made every person in that room disappear from my mind. Mom, why did the Pentagon just call Dad? Everything changed in that moment. For a second, I forgot where I was. The operations center faded into the background. The computer monitors, the radios, the low hum of conversation, all of it disappeared behind the sound of Emily trying to catch her breath. Emily, I said, keeping my voice as steady as I could. Slow down. Tell me exactly what happened. I don't know everything. Start with what you do know, she sniffled. We were opening presents early, because Melissa's parents wanted to leave first thing in the morning. Dad's phone rang around 11:30. He looked at the screen, and I've never seen his face go white like that. What did he do? He walked outside, and when he came back in, he said it was work. I frowned. My father hadn't worked for the Department of Defense in almost 10 years. He'd retired from civilian contracting after leaving active duty. There wasn't much reason for anyone at the Pentagon to be calling him on Christmas Eve. Then another call came. Emily continued. This time he answered in the kitchen. Melissa followed him. I reached for a notepad on my desk and started writing. Go on. I heard somebody say they needed to speak with both of them. Did they say why? No. What happened next? Emily let out a shaky breath. Dad started arguing. That got my attention. My ex-husband, David Carter, wasn't an emotional man. During our 26 years of marriage, I'd seen him raise his voice maybe 5 times. He believed problems were solved with lists, schedules, and checkbooks, not shouting. He kept saying there had to be some mistake, Emily said. And Melissa, she locked herself in the guest bedroom. I blinked. Locked herself in? She wouldn't come out. What about her parents? They had no idea what was going on. They just sat there staring at each other. I glanced at the wall clock. 12:08. Then what? Emily lowered her voice. About 20 minutes later, 2 government cars pulled into the neighborhood. My pen stopped moving. Government cars? I think so. Black SUVs. Did they come to the house? Yes. Did they come inside? They talked to Dad on the front porch. For how long? I don't know, maybe 15 minutes. I leaned back in my chair. None of this made sense. David wasn't the kind of man who got into trouble. In fact, one of the biggest reasons our marriage fell apart was because he hated taking risks. Everything had to be planned. Vacations, budgets, even grocery shopping. If milk wasn't on the list, we weren't buying milk. The idea of investigators showing up at his front door sounded almost impossible. Emily spoke again. Mom, I'm here. They kept asking about military records. I looked down at my notes. Military records? They also wanted Melissa. That landed even harder. Melissa? Yes. What does Melissa have to do with military records? I don't know. Neither did I. I'd met Melissa exactly 4 times. She was pleasant enough, always smiling, always calling everyone sweetheart. She taught 3rd grade outside Charlotte and liked posting photos of homemade desserts on Facebook. Nothing about her suggested federal investigators. Nothing. You don't think Dad's in trouble, do you? Emily asked. I don't know yet. I've been calling him for 20 minutes. He won't answer. Where is he now? I have no idea. I looked over at my supervisor's office. Mark was finishing paperwork. He caught my eye and immediately knew something was wrong. I held up one finger. Just a minute. Emily, are you safe? Yes, is Melissa still there? I think so. You think I left? You left the house? I couldn't stay. Where are you? At Lauren's apartment. I recognized the name. Lauren had been Emily's college roommate. Good. I didn't know who else to call. That sentence hit me harder than the rest. For the first time in years, when everything fell apart, my daughter called me first. Not her father, me. I need you to stay where you are, I said. Lock the door if you're alone. Okay. I'm going to head your way. You are? Yes, it's Christmas, I noticed. Despite everything, she let out a weak laugh. It lasted maybe 2 seconds, but it was enough. I stood up and walked toward Mark's office. He took one look at my face. Family emergency, I think. So, go, I'll owe you. You've covered enough holidays for everybody else. I grabbed my coat from the back of my chair. One of the younger specialists called after me. Merry Christmas, Miss Carter. I smiled without turning around. You too. The air outside was cold enough to sting. My pickup, a 12-year-old blue Ford F-150, started on the second try. I pulled out of the parking lot and headed toward Interstate 95 before cutting west. The roads were almost empty. Most people were asleep or sitting around living rooms, putting together bicycles and dollhouses. My headlights stretched across miles of dark highway. Every now and then, I'd pass a Waffle House, glowing like a lighthouse in the night. Open, always open. About 40 minutes into the drive, Emily called again. Any news? No. Have you heard from your dad? Nothing. What about Melissa? No, she hesitated. Mom? Yes. I feel awful. Why? Because I told you not to come. I tightened my hands on the steering wheel. Emily, no. I need to say it. She took a deep breath. I thought I was doing the right thing. I know. I didn't want Melissa to feel uncomfortable. I understand. I didn't think. Her voice cracked again. I didn't think I'd end up wishing you were there. I swallowed hard. For years after the divorce, I'd imagined hearing those words. Now that they had finally come, they didn't feel like victory. They just felt sad. I've made plenty of mistakes too, I said. We're not talking about you. No, we're talking about family. Neither of us spoke for nearly a minute. The tires hummed against the pavement. Finally, Emily asked, Do you think Dad lied to us? I don't know. And Melissa, I don't know that either. The truth was, my mind kept circling one question. Why would anyone from the Pentagon care about my ex-husband's wife? Melissa had never served. As far as I knew, nobody in her immediate family had either. The pieces simply didn't fit. Around 1:45 in the morning, my phone buzzed again. Unknown number. I answered through the truck's speaker. This is Linda Carter. A calm male voice replied. Miss Carter, my name is Special Agent Brian Holloway. My stomach tightened. I'm with the Department of Defense. I pulled into a rest area without even thinking. How can I help you? We understand you're the former spouse of David Carter. That's right. We'd appreciate the opportunity to speak with you. About what? There was a brief pause. I'm afraid I can't discuss the details over the phone. Is David under arrest? I can't answer that. Is my daughter in danger? No, ma'am. That answer came quickly. It sounded honest. I'll be in Charlotte within 2 hours. We'll arrange a meeting after you arrive. He gave me a phone number. I wrote it on the back of a gas receipt. Then the call ended. I sat there, staring through the windshield. The parking lot was empty except for one 18-wheeler in an RV, with Christmas lights still glowing around its windows. Something wasn't right. This wasn't about one unexpected phone call anymore. This was bigger, much bigger, and whatever waited for me in Charlotte was about to change far more than one family's Christmas. I reached Charlotte a little after 4:30 in the morning. The city was quiet in that strange way only Christmas morning can be. Traffic lights changed for cars that weren't there. Fast food signs glowed over empty parking lots. A few people walked, dogs bundled up in winter coats, while the rest of the neighborhood slept. Emily met me outside Lauren's apartment building. The second she saw my truck, she ran across the parking lot. She hadn't done that since she was a teenager. The moment she climbed into the passenger seat, she wrapped both arms around me. I'm sorry, she whispered. I held her for a few seconds without saying anything. Some conversations can wait. That hug couldn't. When she finally leaned back, I noticed she still had yesterday's Christmas sweater on. Her mascara had run, and she'd been crying long enough that her eyes were swollen. You eating anything? I asked. She shook her head. I wasn't hungry. Well, I am. She looked surprised. I smiled a little. If we're about to deal with the federal government, I'm not doing it on an empty stomach. That earned the first real smile I'd seen from her all night. We found an old 24-hour diner a few miles away that was still serving breakfast. The place had maybe 6 customers, mostly truck drivers, and a couple of police officers finishing the night shift. The waitress poured coffee without asking. You two look like you've had a rough night. You could say that, I answered. Emily picked at her scrambled eggs while I watched the front window. At exactly 6:05, my phone rang. Special Agent Brian Holloway. We're ready whenever you are, Ms. Carter. He gave me an address. It wasn't a police station. It was a federal office building just outside downtown Charlotte. 20 minutes later, Emily and I walked through a metal detector and into a conference room with beige walls, a long table, and coffee that smelled like it had been sitting there since yesterday. Agent Holloway looked to be in his mid-40s. Neat haircut, dark suit, calm voice. Another woman sat beside him. I'm Special Agent Karen Doyle. We shook hands. Holloway waited until everyone sat down. Miss Carter, thank you for coming. I'd rather know why I'm here. I understand. He opened a thick folder. We're investigating fraudulent claims involving military survivor benefits. I frowned. I'm not following. We believe your former husband's current wife, Melissa Carter, falsely represented herself for several years as the surviving spouse of a deceased service member. For a second, I honestly thought I'd heard him wrong. I'm sorry. What? He repeated it almost word for word. I stared at him. Melissa wasn't married before David. Correct, so how could she claim to be someone's widow? Through forged documentation, Emily gasped. No, Agent Doyle slid several copies of paperwork across the table. Names, benefit forms, copies of identification, photographs. One picture showed Melissa standing beside a memorial display at a charity event, wearing a black dress and a small pin with a gold star. Another showed her speaking at what looked like a veterans fundraiser. I've never seen these, Emily whispered. Neither had I. Holloway folded his hands. Over the last 4 years, Miss Arnott had multiple events identifying herself as the widow of a soldier killed overseas. But she isn't. No. Then why would anyone believe her? Because she had convincing documents. He tapped the folder. Documents we now know were falsified. I felt my stomach tighten. I'd spent nearly half my life around military families. I'd attended memorial services. I'd stood beside wives who received folded American flags. I'd watched children ask questions no child should ever have to ask. Pretending to belong to that community wasn't just dishonest. It was personal. Emily covered her mouth. Oh my God. There is more, Doyle said quietly. I wasn't sure I wanted to hear it. The investigation indicates your former husband became aware of the fraud approximately 2 years ago. Emily looked up so fast her chair squeaked. What? He knew. We have evidence suggesting he did. No, she shook her head over and over. No, he wouldn't. Agent Holloway didn't interrupt. He simply placed another document on the table, a series of emails. One message from David read, "We need to stop using that story. Somebody's eventually going to ask questions," Melissa had replied. They never do. Another message. As long as paperwork matches, we're fine. Emily pushed the papers away. I don't want to read anymore. Neither did I, but I forced myself to. Years in the Army had taught me something important. Facts don't become less true because they're painful. We're trying to understand how much Mr. Carter knew, Holloway said. Were they collecting money? I asked, among other things. He explained that Melissa had accepted speaking honorariums, charitable donations, travel reimbursements, and special assistance programs intended for Gold Star families. She'd also received discounts from businesses that wanted to honor military survivors. Each individual amount wasn't enormous. Together, they added up to tens of thousands of dollars. Meaty Emily buried her face in her hands. My dad helped hide this. We're still determining exactly what role he played. I leaned back in my chair. The room suddenly felt much smaller. My marriage hadn't ended because David was dishonest. It had ended because we grew into different people. I'd always respected one thing about him, his integrity. Me now, even that was cracking. As we left the conference room, another man walked past wearing an old army jacket. He noticed the paperwork tucked under Holloway's arm. Without knowing any details, he muttered under his breath, "Every year, somebody tries to wear a uniform they never earned." His words stayed with me. Outside, Emily finally asked the question we'd both been avoiding. "What happens now?" "I don't know." She looked at me with tears forming again. "Mom," clears throat, "yeah, if this all comes out, everybody's going to know." She wasn't worried about gossip. She was worried about losing the father she'd believed she knew. I understood because I was quietly grieving the same thing. That afternoon, I drove past David's subdivision. News vans hadn't arrived yet. The street looked perfectly ordinary. Kids rode bicycles. Neighbors waved at each other. Christmas decorations still hung from porches. Behind one of those front doors, an entire life was falling apart, and almost nobody knew it. I could have driven away. Part of me wanted to. After all, David wasn't my clear's throat responsibility anymore. Melissa certainly wasn't. I could have told the investigators I didn't know anything and gone back to Fort Liberty. Instead, I sat in the truck for nearly 15 minutes thinking, wondering whether opening old wounds was worth it, whether exposing the truth would only hurt Emily more. Then my phone buzzed. It was Agent Holloway. "Miss Carter, we've identified several military charity events where you may recognize people involved." I closed my eyes. Those weren't just names on a list. Many of them were people I'd worked beside. People who had trusted someone wearing a borrowed story. I finally answered, "I'll help." Even as the words left my mouth, I knew helping would come with a price. The hardest part wasn't going to be proving what Melissa had done. It was accepting that the man I'd spent half my life with might have chosen a lie over the values he once taught our daughter. And that truth hurt more than I expected. I thought the hardest part would be sitting across from federal investigators. I was wrong. The hardest part was going home and pretending everything still felt normal. 3 days after Christmas, I was back at Fort Liberty answering emails, reviewing supply requests, and approving emergency staffing schedules. The coffee tasted the same, the fluorescent lights buzzed the same way they always had. Outside my office window, soldiers hurried across the parking lot with backpacks slung over their shoulders. Life kept moving. Mine just happened to be carrying around a secret. Agent Holloway had warned me that investigations like this didn't wrap up in a week. They took time. "Facts first," he told me during one of our phone calls. "Opinions can wait." I liked that. It reminded me of something an old command sergeant major used to say: "Slow is smooth, smooth is fast." So instead of chasing rumors, I started with what I actually knew. I pulled out old address books I'd never thrown away. Retirement ceremony programs, Christmas cards from military families, contact lists from charity events I'd helped organize years earlier. One name led to another. Some people remembered Melissa immediately. Others didn't remember her at all until I mentioned a fundraiser or banquet. One afternoon, I drove to Fayetteville to meet my old friend Denise Walker for lunch. Denise had retired from Army finance before I did. If anyone understood military benefits, it was her. She slid into the booth carrying 2 cups of coffee. "You sounded serious on the phone." "I am." I carefully explained only what Agent Holloway had authorized me to discuss. Denise listened without interrupting. When I finished, she leaned back. "I remember her." "You do barely. From where?" "A military appreciation dinner in Raleigh." "What stood out?" Denise frowned. She kept telling people her husband died overseas. I nodded. "Did anyone question her?" "No. Why not?" Denise looked at me like the answer should have been obvious. "Because decent people don't assume someone would lie about something like that." That sentence stayed with me the rest of the day. Read decent people, don't expect cruelty dressed up as grief. Over the next 2 weeks, I met with 4 more former coworkers. Each conversation added another small piece. Nobody had seen the whole picture. One volunteer remembered Melissa collecting donations. Another remembered introducing her as a Gold Star widow during a community event. Someone else recalled David quietly standing beside her, smiling politely while she thanked people for supporting families like ours. Every story sounded harmless by itself. Together they painted something entirely different. Agent Holloway called me every few days. We're making progress. Good. We've confirmed several financial records. What about David? A pause. We're still sorting that out. That answer never changed. Meanwhile, word began spreading around Charlotte. Not the facts, the rumors. By the second week of January, people had invented stories that sounded like bad television plots. Someone claimed David had stolen classified documents. Another insisted Melissa had been a foreign spy. One ridiculous rumor said investigators found hidden cash buried in the backyard. None of it was true. The real story was quieter and somehow sadder. Then the whispers turned toward me. Emily called one evening after work. "Mom, I can hear it in your voice," she sighed. "I ran into Dad's neighbor today, and she said people think you're behind all this." I didn't answer right away. Emily continued. "They're saying you're just trying to get revenge, because Dad remarried." I looked out my apartment window. Rain slid slowly down the glass. I wondered how long it would take. "You don't seem surprised." "I'm not. Whenever people don't know the truth, they usually choose the simplest explanation. The bitter ex-wife made an easy villain. I told her she was wrong. Thank you. But I waited. I think Dad believes it too. That hurt. Not because David blamed me. Because after 30 years together, he should have known better. The next morning, I found an envelope tucked under my office door. No return address. Inside was a folded sheet of notebook paper. One sentence: "Some families deserve to stay buried." No signature, no threat, just that. I showed it to base security anyway. They documented it and advised me not to worry unless more appeared. Still, I locked my apartment door twice that night. A week later, Agent Holloway asked if I'd be willing to review photographs from several veterans' events. Most were ordinary banquet pictures. People shaking hands, smiling, holding certificates. Then I stopped at one photo. There. Holloway looked over my shoulder. "What caught your attention?" "The woman beside Melissa. Do you know her?" "Yes, her name was Carol Simmons. Her son Jason had actually been killed while serving overseas. I'd attended his memorial service. I'd watched Carol accept the folded flag. If Melissa stood beside Carol pretending to share the same loss, I couldn't finish the thought. Holloway quietly wrote down Carol's name. A few days later he called back. "You were right. What happened?" "Mrs. Simmons believed Melissa was a fellow Gold Star spouse. I closed my eyes, so she trusted her. Yes. And Melissa let her. Yes." For the first time since this nightmare began, anger pushed past the sadness. Not loud anger, cold anger, the kind that settles in your chest and refuses to leave. A few evenings later, I attended a monthly breakfast at the Veterans of Foreign Wars Hall, where several old friends gathered. I hadn't planned to mention the investigation, but retired Colonel Frank Delaney pulled me aside before I could leave. "I've been hearing things." "I'm sure you have." He studied my face. "You look tired." "I am." He nodded toward 2 empty chairs. "Sit." Frank had always spoken like he had nowhere else to be. Sometimes that alone made people tell the truth. After listening quietly, he stirred his coffee. "You know what's bothering you?" "I can think of several things. You still feel responsible for protecting your daughter's relationship with her father. He wasn't wrong. I don't want to destroy what's left." "You aren't." "I might." "No." He shook his head gently. "The person who tells the truth isn't the one who breaks trust." I looked down at my coffee. "What if Emily never forgives me?" "Then give her time." He smiled. "Truth doesn't get louder because you yell." I recognized the line immediately. "It gets stronger with evidence." He laughed. "Looks like somebody else taught you that before I did." Driving home, I kept replaying those words. For weeks, I'd been asking myself whether helping the investigation made me vindictive, whether somewhere deep down I wanted David to suffer. The honest answer surprised me. I didn't. I wanted the pretending to stop. I wanted people like Carol Simmons to never again wonder if the stranger hugging them at a memorial service had earned the right to stand there. The revenge I thought I wanted was slowly changing into something else. Not payback, accountability. Still, I knew the hardest days were ahead, because evidence doesn't stay hidden forever. Sooner or later, every document, every email, every witness statement would leave the investigators' folders and enter a courtroom. And when that happened, there would be no more hiding behind rumors. Only the truth, however painful it turned out to be. By the time spring arrived, the investigation was no longer a secret. It hadn't become front-page national news, but around Charlotte and the military communities nearby. People were talking. Most of them still didn't know the full story. They knew there was an investigation involving military benefits, a local charity, and a couple everyone thought they knew. The federal prosecutor called me on a Tuesday afternoon. "We're ready to move forward." I had known that call was coming. Still hearing the words made my stomach tighten. A hearing was scheduled at the federal courthouse in Charlotte. It wouldn't be a dramatic television courtroom with surprise witnesses and shouted objections. Most real courtrooms aren't like that. They move methodically, one piece of evidence at a time. Sometimes that's even more powerful. Emily called me the night before. "I don't know if I can go." "You don't have to, but if I don't," she stopped. "If you don't, you'll always wonder," she sighed. "I hate that you're right. I don't enjoy being right." That made her laugh just for a second. "I'll meet you there." The courthouse was already busy when I arrived. Veterans in jackets covered with service patches stood quietly in small groups outside the entrance. A few reporters waited behind metal barricades. Television cameras were pointed toward the front steps, hoping someone would say something dramatic. Nobody did. David arrived with his attorney. For the first time in months, I saw my former husband face to face. He looked older, not because of gray hair, because he'd started carrying himself like a man who hadn't slept well in a very long time. Our eyes met for only a moment. Neither of us waved. Melissa walked several steps behind him. Gone was the cheerful woman who used to post smiling holiday photos online. She looked exhausted. No makeup, shoulders slumped. She kept staring at the ground as photographers called her name. Inside the courtroom, everything felt surprisingly ordinary. Wooden benches, American flag, the quiet shuffle of papers. Judge Eleanor Brooks entered exactly on time. The hearing began. The prosecutor laid out the case without raising his voice. He explained how military survivor programs depended on honest documentation. He described the false applications, the altered records, and the financial benefits Melissa had received by claiming to be someone she wasn't. Then came the witnesses. One charity director testified that Melissa had been invited to speak because organizers believed she was a Gold Star widow. A business owner described donating thousands of dollars in services for military families. Another witness explained how special travel expenses had been approved for Melissa so she could attend remembrance events around the state. Each story sounded generous. Each act of kindness had been built on a lie. Then Carol Simmons took the stand. She walked slowly, holding a folded handkerchief. I remembered standing beside her years earlier at her son's memorial service. She still carried herself with quiet dignity. The prosecutor asked a simple question. "Mrs. Simmons, why did you trust the defendant?" Carol looked toward Melissa, because I believed she understood what it meant to lose a child to military service. The room became completely still. "I invited her into my home," Carol continued. "I introduced her to other families. I cried with her." She paused. "I didn't know I was crying with a stranger wearing someone else's grief." Nobody moved. Even the reporters stopped typing. Melissa lowered her head. The prosecutor thanked Carol and sat down. Then Agent Holloway testified. He walked the court through financial records, email exchanges, event registrations, and identification documents. Nothing flashy, just facts. One after another. Finally, the prosecutor displayed several emails on the courtroom monitor. One message from David appeared on the screen. "Someone's eventually going to verify your records." Melissa had answered. "Nobody ever does." Another message followed. "We need to stop before this gets bigger," her reply. After this fundraiser, we're done. The fundraiser had not been the end. It had continued for almost 2 more years. David's attorney advised him to testify. I wasn't sure why. Maybe they hoped honesty would lessen the consequences. Maybe there simply wasn't another option. David walked to the witness stand. For the first few minutes, he answered quietly. Yes, he had discovered Melissa wasn't who she claimed to be. Yes, they had argued about it. Yes, he had told her to stop. Then the prosecutor asked the question everyone had been waiting for. Mr. Carter, after learning the truth, did you continue attending events where your wife falsely represented herself as a Gold Star widow? David closed his eyes for a moment. Yes. Were you aware donations were being accepted? Yes. Were you aware businesses provided benefits based on those claims? Yes. Why didn't you report it? His voice dropped so low I could barely hear him. I convinced myself it wasn't hurting anyone. The prosecutor didn't respond. He simply returned to his table. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument could have been. Then from the gallery, someone quietly spoke. It was Carol. She wasn't addressing the judge. She was looking directly at David. My son gave his life wearing that uniform. Her voice never rose. Pretending that sacrifice belongs to someone else always hurts someone. No one interrupted her. The judge simply allowed the words to settle over the room. I looked toward Emily. Tears were running down her face. Not loud sobbing, just quiet tears, the kind that come when the person you've admired your whole life suddenly becomes someone you barely recognize. Court recessed for lunch. As people filtered into the hallway, a local reporter approached me. Mrs. Carter, would you like to comment? I shook my head. This day isn't about me. What do you think justice looks like? I thought about that before answering. Justice isn't humiliating people. I glanced toward the courtroom doors. It's making sure the truth reaches the people who deserved it all along. That afternoon, the judge accepted Melissa's guilty plea to multiple fraud-related charges. Sentencing would come later, but the facts were now part of the public record. David wasn't charged with the same offenses, but the court made it clear that his cooperation with the deception carried serious civil and financial consequences. He would spend years paying back what should have been accepted. As people left the courthouse, nobody celebrated. There was no applause, no cheering. Real life rarely gives you those moments. Instead, there was something quieter. Veterans gathered around Carol Simmons. One by one, they hugged her, not because she'd won anything, because she'd finally been told the truth. Emily walked over to me. For a long moment, she couldn't speak. Then she reached for my hand. I understand now. I squeezed her fingers. Neither of us needed to say anything else. Sometimes the most satisfying kind of revenge isn't watching someone fall. It's watching the lies finally lose their place to the truth. Life has a way of returning to ordinary, even after something that feels like it should change everything forever. By the end of summer, the television crews had stopped calling. The newspaper stories had moved on to other headlines. Around Fort Liberty, people had gone back to talking about training schedules, weather forecasts, and football. The investigation was over. Melissa had been sentenced to probation, substantial financial restitution, community service, and a permanent record that would follow her for the rest of her life. She quietly resigned from her teaching job before the school district completed its own review. David faced years of repaying money connected to the fraudulent claims and lost consulting opportunities that had once come easily. Word travels quickly in military circles. Trust once broken isn't something you rebuild with a handshake. I didn't celebrate any of it. There wasn't much to celebrate. One Saturday morning in October, my phone rang while I was trimming the little maple tree outside my apartment. It was David. I stared at the screen for a long moment before answering. Hello, Linda. His voice sounded tired. I won't keep you long. All right. I owe you an apology. The word surprised me. Not because I thought he was incapable of apologizing, because I'd stopped expecting one years ago. I blamed you, he admitted. I know. It was easier than admitting I'd made a terrible decision. I rested the pruning shears against the porch railing. You didn't just make one decision, David. I know. Another silence settled between us. I kept telling myself she'd stop, he said quietly. I believed every promise because it meant I didn't have to face what was happening. You wanted the problem to disappear on its own. Yes, it almost never works that way. No, he let out a long breath. I don't expect forgiveness. I appreciate the apology. That was the truth. Some relationships don't return to what they once were. They simply become more honest than they used to be. Before hanging up, he said one last thing. You raised Emily better than I gave you credit for. I looked across the parking lot where a couple of neighborhood kids were riding bicycles. We both raised her. I almost made her pay for my mistakes. Neither of us had anything left to add. We ended the call. A week later, Emily invited me to lunch at a little barbecue restaurant halfway between Charlotte and Fort Liberty. When I arrived, she was already waiting in a corner booth. She looked different, not older, lighter, as if carrying the truth, even a painful one, weighed less than carrying confusion. She hugged me before either of us sat down. After the waitress took our order, Emily wrapped both hands around her iced tea. I've been thinking a lot, I figured. I keep replaying that phone call. The Christmas one? She nodded. The one where I told you not to come. I smiled gently. I remember. I can't believe I said that. You were trying to keep everybody happy. I was trying to avoid conflict. Most people do. She looked down at the table. I thought if I arranged everything just right, we'd finally feel like one big family. You wanted peace. Instead, I confused peace with pretending. I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. That's a lesson some people never learn. Tears filled her eyes again. I should have invited you. I smiled. I would have come. I know. She laughed softly through the tears. And you probably would have noticed something was wrong before anyone else. I've had a lot of practice reading a room. That earned a genuine laugh. The kind that comes from relief instead of pain, over pulled pork sandwiches and sweet tea. We talked for nearly 3 hours. Not just about the investigation, about everything. Her childhood, army life, my years working holidays, the fishing trips David used to take her on, the Christmas ornaments we'd packed away every January. For the first time in years, it felt like we weren't walking around old arguments. We were simply talking. Thanksgiving came and went quietly. Emily insisted on hosting, just the two of us. We burned the rolls, forgot the cranberry sauce, laughed so hard at my failed attempt to carve the turkey that we ended up ordering pumpkin pie from the grocery store, instead of pretending my homemade one was edible. It turned out to be one of my favorite holidays in years. Then December arrived. The little artificial tree came out of the closet again, still leaning to the left, still missing one branch near the back. Some things never change. A week before Christmas, my supervisor, Mark Reynolds, stopped by my office, so I looked up from my paperwork. So you volunteering for Christmas duty again? I smiled. I can cover part of the morning. He raised an eyebrow. Only part. My daughter's expecting me for dinner. He grinned. I was hoping you'd say that. Christmas Day arrived cold and bright. I spent the morning helping with staffing issues and answering the occasional phone call. Around noon, I gathered my things. As I walked through the operations center, one of the younger soldiers called after me. Have a good Christmas, Miss Carter. You, too. The drive to Charlotte felt different this time. Not because the roads had changed, because I wasn't wondering whether I belonged. Emily opened the front door before I even knocked. The smell of baked ham drifted through the house. She wrapped me in a hug. Merry Christmas, Mom. Merry Christmas, sweetheart. Inside, the dining room table wasn't crowded. No complicated seating arrangements, no walking on eggshells. Just family trying to do better than they had the year before. After dinner, Emily handed me a small gift. Inside was a new Christmas ornament, hand-painted wood, a tiny pickup truck carrying a crooked little tree. I laughed the moment I saw it. It leans. So does yours. We both laughed. Then we hung it on the tree together. Looking back now, people sometimes ask whether I think I got revenge. I usually tell them, they're asking the wrong question. What mattered wasn't watching someone lose a reputation or pay back money. What mattered was that people who had been deceived finally received honesty instead. The truth couldn't erase the hurt, but it stopped the hurt from spreading. If there's one thing this experience taught me, it's that character often reveals itself when telling the truth becomes uncomfortable. And if this story stayed with you, I hope you'll share it with someone who believes integrity still matters. If you've ever had to choose between staying quiet and doing what's right, I hope you found the strength to make the choice you could live with.